For an impulse to pass from your sensory receptors to your muscle, there first has to be a stimulus. An example of this is touching a hot pan. When you touch the pan, your sensory receptors pass the impulse from your receptors through your neurons to your motor effectors. The motor effectors move your muscles so that you move away from the pan. As this diagram shows, when you touch the pan, the electrical impulse builds up and is then sent through your interneuron to your motor neuron. This can only happen once the charge builds up enough in the interneuron. There's a threshold you have to reach to pass the impulse onto your motor neuron. This in turn passes the impulse onto your muscle. The impulse moves your muscle away from the hot pan and prevents harm. This chain of events is called a reflex arc. The impulse is never sent to your brain, and so the process is a reflex, which means your body does it almost no matter what.
Neurons transmit information using electrical signals. Ion movement across the cell membrane creates these signals. Resting potential is when the neuron isn't sending signals. The sodium-potassium pumps move 3 sodium ions out of the neuron, while 2 potassium ions are moved in when ATP is added. The sodium-potassium pumps are not examples of co-transportation because the ions are flowing against the electrochemical gradient. These ion carriers are examples of active transportation because the ions are moving into areas of higher concentration. A cell's resting potential is when the charge outside the cell membrane is more positive than that inside the neuron. This creates a charge gradient. When a charge travels through the neuron, the sodium channels open. When sodium ions enter the cell, depolarization occurs.
Pictured here are the dendrites in the cell body. The dendrites are extensions from the cell body that receive signals from other neurons and then send these signals into the cell body. The dendrites receive many signals from other neurons. When enough signals are received, an action potential is sent down the axon. This causes the voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open and let sodium diffuse across these channels and into the cell through a process called facilitated diffusion. This then causes depolarization and the cell to be more positively charged. The sodium-potassium pumps are pumping 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions in, both against their concentration gradients, which is why ATP is required. The potassium ion channels are then opened, causing facilitated diffusion of potassium ions and overall repolarization, which is why the cell goes back to a negative charge. The potassium channels are usually open too long, causing hyperpolarization, but the sodium-potassium pumps slowly return the neuron to resting potential. Here, the cell gets depolarized and then repolarized, showing the flow of ions and the changes in charges.
As the impulse passes down the neuron, it reaches the axon terminal. In the axon terminal, there is the synapse, which has 3 major parts. The axon, which is the end of one neuron, the synapse cleft, which is the space in between, and the dendrite, which is the start of the next neuron. Inside of the axon, there are vesicles, which are small membrane sacs with neurotransmitters in them. These vesicles fuse with the membrane of the axon and start exocytosis, which lets the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters attach to the receptor sites of the ion channels on the dendrite, which causes them to open. This lets the positively charged sodium ions diffuse through the channels, a process called facilitated diffusion. This causes depolarization. When the charge reaches a high enough voltage, the electrical impulse will pass on to the next neuron.